Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here for another one of my Versus episodes, one that I have had a lot of requests to do ever since this lens got released earlier in the year. And unfortunately, it took me quite a long time to get one. That has been rectified now, and as you've probably seen at this point, I've got a series of reviews centered around the Samyang AF 135mm f1.8. This is a very high quality telephoto prime for Sony E-mount, and of course it is placed up against one of what I consider to be one of the very best lenses on Sony, period. And as far as their non-super telephoto primes, I consider this and the 50mm f1.2 to be kind of the upper echelon at this point. And so the question to be answered here today is, can this lens that costs less than $1,000 compete with one of Sony's absolute best? And I'm going to do my best to answer that question, also to maybe give you a little bit of feedback as to which lens you should consider based on your actual performance needs. We'll break all of that down in reasons to buy the Samyang, followed by reasons to buy the Sony. And then if you want a deeper dive, I'm going to have an IQ breakdown at the end where we take a deeper dive into that actual performance. So stay tuned for that if you're interested. First, however, a word from our sponsor.
Today's episode is brought to you by Phantom Wallet, the minimalist modern wallet that is now even better with the new Phantom X that is crafted from aluminum right here in Canada. It is 22% smaller and 35% lighter, while still making it easy to access your cards and money when you need them, thanks to their unique fanning mechanism. You could even customize your wallet due to its modular design, with accessories like a money clip, cash holder, ID display, and even Chipolo and AirTag tracking integration. Visit store.phantomwallet.com to check out their unique sizes, styles, and finishes that span from aluminum to wood to carbon fiber, and use code DUSTIN15 for 15% off when you're ready to check out.
So let's talk about reasons to buy the Samyang. In many ways, there's a lot of similarities between these lenses, but there are a few distinctions that I want to highlight here. First of all, the big one is the price. The MSRP for the Samyang is $999 US, though at the moment I do note that it is available for $899, making it a tremendous value and probably the best bang for buck optically that you're going to find on the Sony platform for under $1,000. The Sony is more expensive at right under $2,100 US, though I have recently seen the price as low as around $2,000. And so either way, you're talking about at least $1,000 difference between the two lenses. At the moment, that price difference is more like $1,200. That's a pretty huge advantage when you consider how much you could purchase with that additional $1,200. The Samyang also is slightly lighter. It weighs in at 772 grams or 27 ounces versus 950 grams or 33.5 ounces for the GM. Now I will note the Samyang isn't smaller, but it is a little less dense, and so it is the easier lens to carry along. Another advantage comes on the optic side, whereas we'll see in more detail later, the Samyang sports slightly less distortion, basically no distortion, and very, very little vignette, a surprisingly low amount for a large aperture lens like this. The Sony is actually also quite good, but it is not quite as good in either metric as what the Samyang is. I also felt, both in my test where I looked for it in detail and then also as a general impression, that the Samyang had slightly softer bokeh, and defocus regions were just a little bit creamier, a little fewer hard edges, and we'll try to break that down a little bit more in the optical comparison. I also found that it did have slightly nicer bokeh geometry, and what I mean by that is that it has more circular shapes across more of the frame with less of a deformation towards cat eye or lemon shape when compared to the G Master lens. It also has a little bit better edge performance, something that is borne out in the MTFs and then also in my real world test. And that as you move closer to the edge of the frame, there's a slight but real advantage for the Samyang there. Also, finally, the Samyang has some specific features for astrophotography that allow you to get accurate focus, even in the night where it's a little more difficult to do that sometimes. And then also it has a very, very high performance in terms of low coma. And so it gives it a little bit of an advantage when it comes to that. So let's talk about reasons to buy the Sony instead. To me, the top reason to buy the Sony instead is when it comes to autofocus speed. Samyang has a single linear motor, whereas the 135 G Master has dual XD linear motors. And XD, to break that down, essentially means that they're higher torque motors. And as a byproduct of that, there is definitely a difference in autofocus speed and confidence, as you can see here. Also, an advantage for the Sony is that, kind of along the same vein, that because it's a first-party lens and a high-performing one at that, if you're shooting with one of Sony's sports-related cameras, you're going to be able to unlock their full burst rate. And so with my Sony Alpha 1, that means 30 frames per second. On a A9 or A9 Mark II, that means 20 frames per second. Whereas third-party lenses like the Samyang are going to be capped at 15 frames per second. Now, if you're not shooting with the sports body, that's not a big deal. If you don't shoot sports, maybe it's not a big deal. But this is a lens that very much could be used in some sporting situations as a sideline lens, or, for that matter, maybe performance arts, and it is a top-notch autofocus performer. It also has higher grade build materials. While the Samyang is not bad made at all, I actually find it to be quite nice, the GM lenses are Sony's best, and so they just have a higher grade of materials. And also I will note that even when it comes to weather sealing, there are 10 seal points in the G Master, while there are 7 seal points in the Samyang. Hopefully both would provide enough, but if you're concerned about weather sealing, the GM is just at another level. It also has a dedicated aperture ring that does give you the option of declicking it. Now, you can turn the manual focus ring into an aperture ring via the custom mode here on the side of the Samyang, but it doesn't give you the visual representation of what a dedicated aperture ring does, in that you can just visually look at it and know what aperture you're at, whereas with the Samyang, you're going to have to look inside the camera, and you don't have the declick option that you do with the G Master lens. I will note that, while again it's a slight advantage, but an advantage nonetheless, the G Master sports a very slightly higher level of magnification. It is 0.25 times versus 0.24 times, and I also felt that the G Master performance was every bit as good, if not a hair better, up close, making it a very useful lens, particularly if you add like extension tubes as a pseudo macro type lens. The GM also has very slightly more center sharpness and pop there in terms of contrast. And so in many ways that could be the most important place to have that extra little bit, as compared to the Samyang, which wins out on the edges, which are often less important in a telephoto type lens. Finally, just as a matter of practicality, the GM is going to have full first-party support on every level, from profiles to, Samyang does do firmware updates and all of that, but obviously a Sony lens is going to get Sony support. And it's also going to have a higher level of resale value as well, because it is a premium product from a premium brand. So what's not really all that different is when it comes to eye detection and portrait sharpness, something I know that a lot of people would be interested in. And we'll dive into that more in our IQ breakdown. But as you can see from these series of shots, I had my wife, who's not a photographer, take these shots just using IAF in camera on the Sony Alpha 1, and just taking a series of shots just to test how well the IAF worked in focusing and how great a sharpness it delivered. And as you can see, there is very little difference between the Samyang and the Sony results. And so that's something that both lenses do exceptionally well, but not necessarily a whole lot one being better than the other. So at the end of the day, which one should you buy? Well, the Samyang is very clear the bargain choice. And as we're going to see even further, it gives up very little in optical performance, and frankly, it doesn't really give up a whole lot in features either. If you're looking for a high value lens at the 135mm focal length, the Samyang is an easy winner. I think the GM is the lens of choice if you want the most demanding autofocus, be it for sports or performing arts, or maybe even just as a portrait photographer, you trust a first-party lens more. And I do think you get a little bit more when it comes to autofocus, even overall autofocus consistency. The GM is exceptionally good, and so as a byproduct of that, if you are the most demanding of users and you want the very best, then I think the G Master is the lens of choice still. But I think for very many people, you're going to experience quite little difference between the two if you're looking at the more budget option as well. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want to stay tuned for the image quality breakdown, you can stay tuned for that. And if not, however, there are links to my full text reviews and video reviews in the description down below, also buying links if you'd like to purchase those. And of course, If you want to have more information, let's dive into the image quality breakdown.
Okay, let's start by taking a deeper dive into this comparison here that we briefly saw in passing. So this really is about a couple of things. Before, we've been looking at the focus accuracy, and so as you can see, both of these are very well focused. And then also it's looking about at the kind of contrast and performance for skin textures. So I mean, quite obviously, both of these lenses are going to reveal probably more skin flaws and blemishes than what your typical person is going to want to deal with. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I would say that I think ever so slightly there's a little bit more contrast for the G Master, though as you can see, if you didn't have them side by side, you really wouldn't see much of a difference, as far as in like the hair here. I do think a little bit more detail for the G Master, but again, very, very close. And as you can see also, skin tones aren't identical, but there's not really anything that is radically different either. And so, color balance, not really a factor here that I can tell either. Now, we mentioned bokeh geometry. We'll detail at that just a little bit. And so here you can see with the Samyang, this is f1.8, then f2, then f2.8, then f4. And so as far as the basic geometry all across the frame, that is really good, as we're going to see a little bit better for the Samyang. However, we're also going to see if we move to the G Master, which you can see here, the G Master has a little bit more deformation towards the edges than what the Samyang did. But we can also see as we stop it down that the aperture blades do a slightly better job of keeping a circular shape as well. So a little bit of give and take there. I think this more apples to apples comparison helps to illustrate that point even better. And so here we've got a fixed location off of a tripod, and so you can see that both of them are focused in the same spot. But if we look over here at the bokeh, you can see that both of them do eventually get towards a cat eye or lemon shape towards the edge. But where we have an advantage is, for example, here, quite circular with the GM already deformed. And then in this area right here, Samyang is very circular, whereas the GM already has some deformation. And so that's kind of a big deal, I think, particularly for some people, in that you're going to get just a little bit rounder bokeh circles out of the Samyang. Now we'll look at a couple of other bokeh-related things. This is just more about the kind of transition area. So again, you can see they're both focused in the same area. As we look towards the transition area, now I made a minor mistake in that I must have bumped the aperture ring and it was at f2 rather than f1.8. That gives a very slight advantage to the GM, but I don't think enough here to make a significant difference. So if we look at here, it's just a little bit softer than what it is on the GM. As I look along this and as I look at the kind of textures on this, I see just a little bit more softness. Also up here, just a little fewer kind of edges that are there. Here's another example here, and while I don't see a major difference in this particular image, I see the geometry thing favors the Samyang on the left a little bit. As we move out of this kind of defocused area and then we look towards over this area, both of them are nice and creamy, and I don't know that one stands out to me more than the other. Now this example here is a little bit interesting in that, again, obviously both set up in the same situation, exact same settings. There was some sun coming through the window that was highlighting this from the back. You can see actually that the GM has done a little bit of veiling here in the corner, whereas the Samyang has actually shown up a little bit better contrast. And so this also gives us a look at any kind of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. I think that there is a tiny bit of a blue-green fringing on the Samyang, very, very little. And I think that maybe the GM is just a little bit more neutral in that regard. And so maybe a slight win for the G Master there. As we look towards the kind of defocused areas here, I do think that the Samyang is a little bit creamier and softer and just a little bit more edging for the G Master. Now, if we talk about these things for portrait work, I did find that as far as my triggers went, that the two didn't trigger identically, and so we have identical settings, but there's just a little bit more flash power for whatever reason that came out using the G Master. And so what we're more looking at is just kind of the defocused background. And in these cases, I think that both of them show a nice transition towards defocus. Likewise in this shot where we have both some foreground and then some background bokeh. If If you look at just the kind of the dock that's in the background and the water beyond, and then at the surface of the water, you can just see there's a little bit more edging in the transition area for the G Master, whereas the Samyang is just ever so slightly softer. Again, I don't think this is a major thing at all, but it is worth considering that there is a very minor, I believe, bokeh advantage in both geometry and then softness for the Samyang. Now, I mentioned the vignette and distortion, so if we look at the GM, nothing significant here. You can see a little bit of pin cushion distortion and a little bit of vignette. Neither is extreme. Now, if we do a manual rather than a profile correction, we can see that there's just a -1 to correct that pin cushion distortion. You're probably not even going to want to bother with that, and a +35 to correct for the vignette. If we jump over to the Samyang required no correction. It basically has so low of distortion that if you tried to correct something, you would create more distortion than you would correct. And then it has a little bit lower vignette, a +28. That's a +7 difference, not significant, but again, in both metrics, just a tiny advantage for Samyang there. All right, our major showdown here, and that comes to sharpness and contrast. This is a 50 megapixel image, and it is shot, or I'm going to show it to you at 200% magnification. So here is where, as mentioned before, I think that the GM shows a little bit more contrast in the center of the frame. Just a little bit more pop there. You can see slightly more of the moire pattern that comes from really intense sharpness and contrast. A little bit in the text, you can see a minor difference there, and even down here, just a very slight advantage for the GM. In the mid-frame, that advantage is, it's largely gone. They're about the same. Down here in the corner, it is actually the Samyang that gives us a little bit stronger performance. You can just see a little bit more detail and contrast here towards the edge of the frame. Now, if we stop them both down to f2.8, we can see that now the contrast has really bloomed for the Samyang, and it is now every bit as contrasty in the center of the frame, and the text popping. Arguably, the Samyang is a hair better. In this mid-frame performance, I think a little bit more contrast than what the GM shows. And down here in the corner, both of them are really good in the edge of the frame. But you can just see, like from this text, there's a little bit more contrast and performance out of the Samyang. We pop over here to the left side. We can see that they both look very good. We'll take a look here as well, a couple of other spots. I very slightly think that there's a little bit more contrast for the G Master there. If we look up in the upper corner here, we can see that they both look very good, but maybe just a hair better on the Samyang with a little bit more contrast that reaches right out to the edge of the frame. We'll do one final comparison at f5.6. And so we can see here in the center of the frame, both of them are exceptional. If anything, I would maybe give the GM the very slightest of edges. It's incredibly close. In the mid-frame, the Samyang is just a little bit better, though, frankly, it's splitting hairs. They're both really brilliant. Down here in the corner, they are both, just fantastic. Both of them just kind of popping right off the page. And so, frankly, the performance all around is just really exceptional. No matter where you look, everything is just fantastic across the frame for both of these lenses. They are exceptionally strong.
So as you can see, these are both incredibly high-performing lenses, and frankly, you're going to be very happy with what you get from either one of these lenses when it comes to their optical performance. So at the end of the day, there are other considerations here, but hopefully I've given you enough information to help you make an informed decision as to which lens is going to work best for you. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, as mentioned, linkage to the full suite of reviews on these, buying links, also linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media, to become a patron, to get channel merchandise. Please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.